The cigarette smoke hung thick in the wings of the Paramount Theatre that February night in 1943, and I could barely make out Frank Sinatra's silhouette against the stage lights. His hands were trembling. Not from fear, mind you, but from something else entirely, a kind of electricity I'd never witnessed in another human being. Beyond the curtain, 3,000 teenage girls were screaming so loudly that the theater's ancient wooden beams seemed to vibrate with their collective voice. Frank turned to me, his blue eyes catching the light for just a moment, and said something I couldn't hear over the roar. Then he smiled, that crooked, confident smile, adjusted his bow tie with those impossibly thin fingers, and stepped into the maelstrom. What happened next would change American entertainment forever, and I was standing 10 feet away when it began. I'm Walter Cronkite, and for more than 6 decades, I've reported on presidents and wars, moon landings, and national tragedies. But that night at the Paramount, I wasn't covering history. I was a young wire service reporter, 26 years old, assigned to what my editor dismissively called the Bobby Soxer beat. Frank Sinatra was the opening act for Benny Goodman's orchestra, a skinny kid from Hoboken who'd recently left Tommy Dorsey's band. Nobody at United Press expected much from the assignment. I certainly didn't. I'd arrived at the theater around 6 in the evening, my notepad tucked into my jacket pocket, expecting to file a few paragraphs about another big band show. The moment I approached the building on Times Square, I knew something extraordinary was unfolding. The line of young women stretched around the block, then around the next block and the next. They weren't just waiting, they were vibrating with anticipation, clutching photographs of Sinatra torn from movie magazines, practicing their screams, comparing notes on which show they'd attended before. Inside the theater's backstage area, the atmosphere was pure chaos. Benny Goodman's musicians were setting up their stands and warming their instruments, but nobody was paying them much attention. The stagehands, the ushers, even the hard-bitten theater manager, everyone was talking about Sinatra. You ever seen anything like this? A stagehand asked me, jerking his thumb toward the audience. It's like the second coming out there. I found Frank in his dressing room, and this is what struck me immediately. He was calm, not the false calm of a nervous performer trying to hide his fear, but genuinely composed. He sat in front of a mirror ringed with bare bulbs, studying his reflection with the concentration of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. His suit was impeccably pressed, dark blue, almost black, with a white shirt so crisp it seemed to glow. He was adjusting his bow tie, tightening it, loosening it, tightening it again. "Mr. Sinatra," I said, introducing myself. "Walter Cronkite, United Press." He turned and extended his hand. His grip was surprisingly firm for someone so slender. "Call me Frank," he said. His voice in conversation was different from his singing voice, rougher around the edges, pure New Jersey. "You here to write about the screaming?" "I'm here to cover the show," I replied diplomatically. He laughed, a short, knowing laugh. "The screaming is the show, pal. Everything else is just the excuse. When Benny Goodman's orchestra opened with Let's Dance, the audience was respectful, even enthusiastic. These were, after all, serious music fans, and Goodman was the king of swing. But there was a restlessness in the theater, a sense of collective impatience. They were waiting for Frank. I positioned myself in the wings, stage left, where I could see both Sinatra and the audience. He was standing in the darkness beside me, completely still, watching Goodman set with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. He was simply waiting, like a panther watching prey. The moment came around 8:30. Goodman stepped to the microphone and said, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the voice that's been thrilling America, Mr. Frank Sinatra." The sound that erupted from that audience wasn't just loud, it was physical. I felt it in my chest, in my bones. It was a sound made up of 3,000 individual voices, but it had become something else entirely, a single, sustained shriek of pure emotional release. Frank walked on stage, and the sound doubled, then doubled again. Girls in the front rows were crying, clutching their faces, reaching toward him with outstretched arms as if he were a life raft and they were drowning. He arrived at the microphone stand, paused, and smiled, just smiled. He didn't wave or bow or acknowledge the screaming in any obvious way. He simply stood there, bathed in spotlight, letting them see him, letting them have this moment. The gesture was brilliant in its simplicity. He understood instinctively that his presence alone was what they'd come for. Then he began to sing. The song was, "I'll Never Smile Again," and the opening notes cut through the screaming like a knife through silk. His voice, that voice, was unlike anything else in popular music. It wasn't the big belting style of the swing era. It was intimate, conversational, as if he were singing directly to each person in that theater. He had a way of sliding into notes, of treating lyrics like personal confessions rather than scripted lines. When he sang, "I'll never smile again until I smile at you," it sounded like he meant every word, like his heart was genuinely breaking. I watched the audience as much as I watched Frank. The girls in the front rows had stopped screaming. They were listening, transfixed, tears streaming down their faces. These were wartime teenagers, many with fathers or brothers overseas.
living with daily uncertainty and fear. Frank's music gave them permission to feel everything they'd been holding inside. His vulnerability made their vulnerability acceptable. Between songs, he spoke to them, not at them, but to them. "You're a beautiful audience," he said, his voice soft and genuine. "Thank you for coming out tonight." The simplicity of his words, the lack of show business patter, made the connection feel personal and real. He sang night and day, Stardust, all or nothing at all. With each song, the emotional temperature in the theater rose. By the time he reached his final number, Embraceable You, the audience was completely his. They swayed together, 3,000 people moving as one, utterly transported. After his set, Frank returned to the wings, and I saw something that has stayed with me for 8 decades. His bow tie was soaked with sweat. His shirt collar wilted, but his expression was serene, almost meditative. He'd just performed what amounted to emotional surgery on 3,000 people, but he looked like a man who'd done nothing more strenuous than take an evening stroll. "How do you do that?" I asked him as we walked back toward his dressing room. "How do you create that kind of connection?" He stopped walking and looked at me with complete seriousness. "You know what those girls are feeling when they scream?" he asked. "They're feeling everything at once: love, fear, hope, loneliness. Their boyfriends are fighting in Europe or the Pacific. Their world is uncertain. When I sing, I'm not performing for them. I'm feeling with them. Every note is honest. The moment you fake it, the moment you pretend, they know, and they leave." We entered his dressing room, where a mob of well-wishers and hangers-on had already assembled. But Frank pulled me aside before the crowd could swallow him. "You want to know the real secret?" he asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I'm not special. I'm just willing to be vulnerable in public. Most people are terrified of that. But vulnerability is what connects us all." Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the theater had emptied, I sat in an all-night diner on 8th Avenue, trying to organize my notes. Everything Frank had said kept running through my mind, but one observation dominated my thinking. I'd just witnessed the birth of something new in American culture. This wasn't just a successful performance or a talented singer having a good night. This was a fundamental shift in the relationship between performer and audience. The singers who'd come before Frank, Bing Crosby, Rudy Vallee, the big band vocalists, they'd maintained a certain professional distance. They were entertainers, yes, but they performed at the audience rather than for them. Frank had demolished that barrier. He'd made popular music personal, intimate, emotionally dangerous. He'd transformed teenage girls from passive listeners into active participants in their own emotional awakening. Over the following weeks, I covered several more Sinatra performances, and I began to understand the full scope of what I'd witnessed. The Paramount engagement became legendary. It ran for weeks, with Frank performing show after show to packed houses of screaming teenagers. The phenomenon was so intense that it acquired its own vocabulary. The girls who fainted were Sinatra-madized, their behavior collectively labeled Sinatra-mani. But there was something deeper happening that most observers missed, something I only understood because I'd been backstage that first night and heard Frank's explanation. These young women weren't hysterical or irrational despite how the media portrayed them. They were responding to authenticity in an era of manufactured images and carefully controlled public personas. Frank's willingness to be emotionally naked, to sing about loneliness and longing without shame or irony, gave them permission to express their own suppressed emotions. I remember interviewing one young woman named Margaret outside the Paramount after she'd attended her 7th consecutive show. She was 18, her fiancé was serving with the Army Air Corps in England, and she worked 6 days a week in a defense plant assembling aircraft components. When Frank sings, she told me, "I don't have to be strong. I don't have to pretend everything's fine. For 3 hours, I can feel what I'm really feeling. And somehow, that makes it easier to go back to work the next day." That conversation changed how I wrote about Sinatra. This wasn't just entertainment news. This was a social phenomenon with genuine cultural significance. Frank had become, quite inadvertently, a kind of emotional pressure valve for an entire generation of Americans living through global crisis. I watched Frank navigate this newfound fame with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. He loved performing, clearly, but the intensity of the audience response sometimes unnerved even him. "They don't really know me," he said to me one evening after a show. "They're in love with what they need me to be. I just hope I can keep giving them that without losing myself in the process." It was a prescient word. Over the following years, I would watch Frank's career ascend to heights no popular singer had ever reached, then crash spectacularly in the early 50s, then resurrect itself in what many consider the greatest comeback in entertainment history. Through all of it, that quality I'd observed in 1943, the willingness to be vulnerable, to perform without artifice, remained constant. In my long career as a journalist, I've interviewed presidents and prime ministers, generals and revolutionaries, astronauts and artists. Frank Sinatra remains one of the most fascinating individuals I ever encountered. Not because he was perfect. He was famously flawed, temperamental, capable of great cruelty and great kindness in equal measure, but because he understood something fundamental about human nature that most people never grasp. The last time I saw Frank was in 1993 at a tribute dinner in New York. He was 77 years old, his voice weathered but still unmistakable. We spoke briefly about that night at the Paramount 50 years earlier, and he laughed when I reminded him of what he'd said about vulnerability. "Did I really say that?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "I must have been trying to impress you." "You succeeded," I told him. He grew serious for a moment. "You know what I remember most about those days? The responsibility. All those kids looking at me like I had answers.
I didn't have any answers. I was just a singer from Hoboken trying to pay the rent, but they needed something from me, and I tried my best to give it to them. That, I think, is the essence of Frank Sinatra's genius and his legacy. He gave millions of people exactly what they needed, even when he wasn't entirely sure what he was giving, or whether he had anything left to give. He sang for soldiers during World War II, for lonely housewives in the suburbs, for civil rights marchers in the 60s, for heartbroken lovers in every decade. He sang through personal triumphs and disasters, through marriages and divorces, through artistic peaks and commercial valleys. And he did it all with that quality I'd observed backstage at the Paramount in 1943, complete emotional honesty. Every note, every phrase, every performance was an invitation to feel deeply, to acknowledge our shared humanity, to recognize that vulnerability isn't weakness but the very foundation of connection. Standing in the wings that February night 8 decades ago, watching a skinny kid from New Jersey step into the spotlight and change American culture forever, I couldn't have predicted the full scope of what would follow. But I knew I was witnessing something extraordinary. I knew that Frank Sinatra had discovered a new language for expressing the inexpressible, and that thousands of young people desperate for authenticity in an uncertain world had understood his language perfectly. That's the story I filed to United Press that night, though my editor cut most of the analysis and left only the basic facts about the performance and the screaming audience. It didn't matter. I knew what I'd seen. I knew that popular music would never be quite the same, that the relationship between performer and audience had fundamentally shifted, that vulnerability had become not just acceptable but desirable in American entertainment. Frank Sinatra didn't invent the American love song, but he reinvented how we listen to it, how we feel it, how we carry it with us through our lives. And for one young wire service reporter standing in the wings of the Paramount Theatre on a cold February night, that was more than enough to justify a lifetime of remembering. This is Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it was. The night Frank Sinatra saved not just a show, but taught an entire generation that it's okay to feel everything, all at once without apology.